As the sun began to rise over Jackson International Airport in Mississippi, the terminal was just waking up, filled with the soft hum of morning activity. Among the early travelers was a retired Army veteran named David R. Thompson, who stood tall despite the weight of his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. His military ID, worn but still recognizable, caught the attention of a young woman at the Delta desk. "Excuse me, sir, are you flying alone today?" she asked, her tired eyes scanning his face for a response. David nodded slowly, his expression calm and measured. He slid the ID across the counter, revealing his service. The agent looked him over, noting his stature over 6 feet tall with an air of authority that came from years of service. However, the subtle drag of his left leg betrayed the fact that he had lost something significant in his life. As he moved, there was a soft click, a reminder of the carbon fiber prosthetic that replaced his missing limb. "Thank you for your service," the agent said, handing back his ID with a hint of admiration. "Always," David replied, folding the ID back into his wallet as he prepared to navigate through the bustling airport. His duffel bag, a dark canvas pouch with no insignia, told stories of its own, having traveled with him through countless deployments. As he made his way toward the TSA checkpoint, the overhead speakers crackled, announcing boarding calls for various flights. He glanced at his boarding pass, noting the time until his flight at Gate B12. As he joined the growing security line, a child ahead of him wailed, while a businessman behind him muttered into a Bluetooth earpiece. David stood quietly, mostly unnoticed by the crowd, but occasionally someone's gaze would linger on his leg before quickly shifting away. It didn't bother him, but what did were the whispers and furtive glances from those who thought he wouldn't notice, snapping photos when they thought he was looking elsewhere. He adjusted the strap of his bag, feeling the familiar ache in his prosthetic as he took a deep breath, mentally preparing for what lay ahead. As the line moved forward, he approached the scanner, becoming the last person before the conveyor belt. That's when he spotted the TSA agent named Ryan, a young man with an air of cockiness and an indifferent attitude. "Step forward," Ryan called out, not bothering to meet David's gaze. David placed his duffel bag on the belt and stepped through the metal detector. Beep. "Here we go," he thought, already anticipating the routine. Ryan raised an eyebrow, showing a hint of interest. "Gonna have to go again, old man?" David turned around, remaining composed as he walked back through the arch. The beep echoed once more, and Ryan's expression shifted slightly. "Looks like we've got a situation with the robot leg," he chuckled, too loud for the early hour. A few people in line raised their heads, some confused, others uncomfortable. No one laughed along, and David maintained his composure. "Combat injury. Afghanistan 2007, he replied flatly. Ryan nodded, but his smirk remained. "Still going to have to check that out, you know. Policy," he said, tapping his walkie-talkie. "Need a supervisor at lane 3. We've got a bionic vet here." Nearby, a voice from the line muttered, "That's not right." David turned slightly, scanning the crowd behind him. An older man frowned, and a teenage girl tugged at her mother's sleeve, but no one stepped forward to defend him. He didn't need them to, though. He had fought harder battles before. Dignity is often quiet, and this moment was no different. Ryan leaned against the podium, his posture relaxed, as if he were on a break rather than at work. "So what's under there? Steel? Titanium? You got some kind of clearance? Or do we need to unscrew the whole thing?" Ryan continued, clearly enjoying the spectacle. David took a breath, choosing his words carefully. He had faced mockery before, especially from those who didn't understand. But this was different. It felt like a performance meant to entertain bystanders. "Left leg below the knee, IED, he finally said, his voice steady. Ryan's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "Still going to need you to step aside." At that moment, another TSA officer, an older woman named Sarah, approached with a demeanor that radiated professionalism. Her name badge read Arbudro, and she looked at David with a hint of sympathy. "What's the issue?" she asked, glancing at the scanner logs. "Metal leg," Ryan replied dismissively. "Bat it off." David lifted the cuff of his pant leg just enough to reveal the sleek, matte black prosthetic. It was military-issued, practical, without any unnecessary embellishment. Sarah's gaze shifted from the leg to David's face, assessing him with a level of respect that Ryan lacked. "You're a retired service member?" she asked. He nodded, aware of the gravity of the moment. "Army Staff Sergeant, 8 years active, 5 with the reserves." Sarah sighed, not out of frustration with him, but with the situation itself. "We'll just do a manual pat-down, sir. Shouldn't take long." Ryan opened his mouth, likely to make another snide comment, but a glance from Sarah silenced him. David followed her to the side, standing in silence as she explained each step of the procedure. "I apologize for the inconvenience," she said gently, her voice sincere. "Some of us forget respect when it's early." "No need to apologize for him," David replied, a hint of understanding in his tone. As she conducted the pat-down, Ryan stood nearby, arms crossed, occasionally glancing at the line and making comments to the impatient travelers. The moment was heavy with unspoken words, and while David remained calm, he felt the eyes of the crowd on him, silently acknowledging the injustice of the situation. When the pat-down concluded, Sarah thanked him and handed back his boarding pass. "Gate B12, she said softly. David nodded in appreciation and began to walk away, the quiet acknowledgement of the crowd resonating within him. As he moved toward the tram to Terminal B, he couldn't help but notice the mix of passengers, flight attendants preparing for their shifts, and airport staff bustling about. Amidst the noise, he felt a sense of camaraderie from a fellow veteran who sat beside him. "That guy at TSA was way out of line," the man said, leaning in a little. David looked over, surprised by the empathy. "You served?" "Yeah," the man replied. "Navy. My dad lost a leg in Desert Storm." David offered a respectful nod. "Respect to your father." As they shared a moment of understanding, the tram rolled to a stop, and David stepped off, ready for whatever lay ahead, feeling the weight of both his past and the support of those around him. As David approached the TSA security checkpoint, the atmosphere shifted. The bustling noise of the airport faded into the background, replaced by the mechanical sounds of the scanner and the occasional announcement over the intercom. David stood in line, feeling the weight of his duffel bag resting against his hip. Despite the early hour, the air felt charged with tension, and he could sense the anxious energy of the travelers around him. The line moved slowly, and he remained calm, focusing on the task ahead. When it was finally his turn, he stepped forward, placing his bag on the conveyor belt. The TSA agent, Ryan, was waiting on the other side, his expression a mix of boredom and bravado. David noticed the young man's posture, leaning casually against the podium, a stark contrast to the seriousness of his job. "Step through the metal detector," Ryan instructed, barely looking David in the eye. David did as he was told, his heart rate steady despite the slight trepidation he felt. As he passed through, the familiar beep echoed through the checkpoint. "Gonna have to go again, old man," Ryan said with a smirk, his tone dripping with condescension. David turned around, controlled and calm, and walked back through the archway, the beep sounding yet again. Ryan's demeanor shifted slightly and he raised an eyebrow, finally taking notice. "Looks like we've got a robot leg situation here." He chuckled louder than necessary, drawing the attention of nearby travelers. A few heads turned, some with curiosity, others with discomfort. David felt their gazes but chose not to react, maintaining his composure. He had faced worse scrutiny before. Combat injury? Afghanistan 2007? he replied flatly, his voice steady, as he held Ryan's gaze. The agent's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his bravado, refusing to acknowledge the weight of David's words.
"Still going to have to check that out, policy," Ryan replied, tapping his walkie-talkie with a casual air, as if discussing the weather rather than a fellow human being's dignity. "Need a supervisor at lane 3. We've got a bionic vet here." A murmur rippled through the line, and David caught snippets of conversations behind him. "That's not right," someone muttered, but no one stepped forward to intervene. David scanned the faces of those around him. An elderly man frowned, and a teenager whispered to her mother, but they remained silent. He didn't need their support, though. He had fought tougher battles before, and this was just another hurdle to navigate. Ryan leaned against the podium, his arrogance evident. "So, what's under there? Steel? Titanium? You got some kind of clearance, or do we need to unscrew the whole thing?" His words were laced with mockery, and David felt a flicker of anger rise within him. This wasn't just disrespect, it was an affront to everything he had sacrificed.
David took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "Left leg below the knee, IED, he finally said, the weight of his experience hanging in the air. The laughter died on Ryan's lips, and for a moment there was silence, the gravity of David's statement resonating with those who overheard. Just then, a more senior TSA officer, Sarah, approached. Her presence radiated professionalism and authority. "What's the issue here?" she asked, her eyes narrowing as she glanced at the scanner logs. "Metal leg," Ryan shrugged, dismissive as ever.
"Bat it off." David lifted the cuff of his pant leg to reveal the matte black prosthetic, sleek and understated. Sarah's gaze shifted from the leg to David's face, and for the first time she seemed to see him as more than just a case to handle. "You're a retired service member?" she asked, her tone softer now. David nodded. "Army Staff Sergeant, 8 years active, 5 in the reserves." Sarah sighed, not at him, but at the situation. "We'll just do a manual pat-down, sir. Shouldn't take long," she said, her voice filled with respect.
Ryan opened his mouth, likely to make another snide comment, but Sarah shot him a glance that silenced him instantly. David followed Sarah to the side where she explained each step of the pat-down. "I apologize for the inconvenience," she said quietly. "Some of us forget respect when it's early." "There's no need to apologize for him," David replied, his voice calm but firm. As Sarah carried out the pat-down, Ryan stood off to the side, arms crossed, occasionally glancing at the line and making comments to the impatient travelers. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension, and though David remained composed, he felt the weight of the crowd's eyes on him. When the pat-down concluded, Sarah thanked him and handed back his boarding pass. "Gate B12, she said gently, her demeanor a refreshing contrast to Ryan's earlier mockery. David nodded appreciatively and walked away, the quiet acknowledgement of the crowd resonating within him. He had faced adversity before, but today was a reminder that respect and dignity still mattered even in the most unexpected places. As he made his way toward the tram to Terminal B, he couldn't shake the feeling of being both invisible and intensely scrutinized. Yet he also felt a sense of resolve. He would not let this moment define him. As David made his way toward the tram that would take him to Terminal B, the weight of the TSA checkpoint lingered in his mind. He felt a blend of emotions swirling within him, frustration, anger, and an underlying sense of resilience. The tram was a crowded space, filled with a mix of flight attendants preparing for their shifts and passengers lost in their own worlds. David found a spot near the back, grateful for the momentary escape from the scrutiny he had faced just moments before. As the tram lurched forward, he shifted his duffel bag on his shoulder and allowed himself to relax slightly. The voices around him blended into a low hum, creating a backdrop of normalcy that contrasted sharply with his recent experience. He glanced out the window, watching the airport landscape blur past, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. Next to him sat a man in a navy blue uniform, his hands stained with grease. He glanced over at David, a look of recognition dawning on his face. "You served?" the man asked, leaning in slightly, his voice low but filled with curiosity. David nodded, appreciating the understanding in the man's tone. "Yeah, Army. I lost my leg in Afghanistan." The man's expression shifted to one of respect. "I'm sorry to hear that. My dad lost a leg in Desert Storm. It's not easy, is it?" David shook his head, a small smile breaking through the heaviness of his thoughts. "No, it's not, but you learn to adapt." The man nodded in agreement. "Respect to you for that. It takes a lot of strength." They shared a brief moment of camaraderie, two veterans acknowledging the burdens they carried, unspoken yet deeply understood. As the tram came to a stop at Terminal B, David stepped off and made his way toward Gate B12. The atmosphere was buzzing with activity, passengers milling about as they prepared for their flights. He scanned the area, noting the rows of seats filled with travelers lost in their phones or engaged in quiet conversations. But his attention was drawn to a familiar voice drifting through the crowd. "Yeah, I was just doing my job," he heard Ryan say, leaning casually against a check-in counter at Gate B9. David's stomach twisted at the sound of the TSA agent's voice, but he forced himself to remain calm. Ryan was speaking to another TSA officer, his tone low but still dripping with arrogance. "These guys think just because they lost a leg they get a free pass through security? Nah, I'm not about that." David felt his heart race as he stood frozen, a few rows away. He glanced around, noticing that some passengers had overheard Ryan's comments. A woman a few seats down raised her eyebrows, clearly shocked by what she had just heard. David was tempted to confront Ryan, to say something, but he held back. Instead, he reminded himself that he had faced tougher battles and that dignity sometimes required silence. As he settled into a seat near the back of the waiting area, he took a deep breath, trying to shake off the tension. Just as he opened a granola bar he had packed, he noticed an older gentleman sitting across the aisle. The man looked over, a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. "I saw what happened at security," the man said quietly. "That was out of line." David appreciated the support, but he shrugged slightly. "People don't always understand what they're looking at," he replied, his voice steady. The older man nodded slowly. "There's a difference between protecting and profiling," he added, his expression thoughtful. As the boarding announcement rang out for another flight, David felt a mix of emotions. He had fought for his country, yet here he was, facing ignorance from someone who held a position of authority. But he also felt a growing sense of solidarity from those who understood. It reminded him that despite the challenges, he wasn't alone. The boarding process began, and David sat back, reflecting on the encounters of the morning. Although there were people who failed to see him for who he was, there were others who recognized his sacrifice and offered respect. It was this balance that made the journey worthwhile. As he prepared to board, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He would not let the disrespect overshadow his experience. Instead, he would carry it with him, a reminder of the importance of understanding and compassion. After all, every story mattered and every voice deserved to be heard. As David approached Gate B12, the atmosphere buzzed with the low hum of conversations and the rustling of luggage. He glanced around, taking in the scene, travelers huddled over their devices, families with children, and business people engrossed in their calls. Yet, amid the chaos, a familiar presence caught his eye. Captain John Kravitz, the pilot of his flight, was standing near the gate, holding a cup of coffee and scanning the boarding area. With a sense of recognition, David felt a rush of gratitude toward the captain. He remembered their brief encounter at the TSA checkpoint, where Kravitz had shown him unexpected kindness in the face of Ryan's disrespect. As David approached, the captain turned and met his gaze, a friendly smile breaking across his face. "David, right?" Kravitz said, extending his hand for a firm shake. "Yes, sir, I appreciate what you did back there," David replied, sincerity evident in his voice. The captain nodded, his demeanor reflecting a quiet strength. "I caught a glimpse of that situation at security. It was out of line," Kravitz said, his tone serious but compassionate. "Some people forget basic respect when it comes to veterans like you." David felt a swell of appreciation. "Thank you. It's frustrating, but I try not to let it get to me." Kravitz leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You shouldn't have to. It's important for people to recognize the sacrifices made by service members, and while I can't change how others act, I can decide who sits where on my flight." David raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "Have you ever flown first class?" Kravitz asked, a glimmer of mischief in his eyes. David shook his head, a mix of surprise and curiosity washing over him. "No, I haven't." "Well, that's about to change," Kravitz said, pulling out a small notepad from his pocket. He scribbled something down quickly and handed it to the gate attendant. She nodded, typed something into the computer, and then printed out a new boarding pass. "Row 2A, right side window," Kravitz announced proudly, handing the new pass to David. David looked down at the pass, disbelief etched across his face. "I didn't ask for this," he began, but Kravitz waved his hand dismissively. "You didn't have to. That was just one person at security." "The rest of us want to show our gratitude," Kravitz said, his expression earnest. "It's important to remind you that not everyone thinks like him." As the boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, David felt a mix of emotions, gratitude, surprise, and a sense of belonging. He had spent so long feeling invisible, and now, with this small gesture, he felt seen in a way that he hadn't expected. "Thank you, Captain," David said, his voice filled with sincerity. "This means a lot to me." "Just doing what's right," Kravitz replied with a nod. "I hope you enjoy the flight." With that, David made his way to the front of the boarding line, heart pounding with a mix of excitement and disbelief. As he approached the gate, he caught sight of Ryan again, who was standing with his clipboard. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and David felt a sense of quiet victory. Ryan looked away first, an indication that perhaps he realized the weight of his earlier actions. Once on board, David was greeted warmly by the flight attendants, their smiles genuine and welcoming. "Right this way, mister." "Thompson," one of them said, guiding him to his newly assigned seat. As he settled into 2A, he marveled at the extra space and comfort. The seat was plush, and a bottle of water awaited him on the tray table. David leaned back, feeling the familiar tension of the morning slowly melt away. He couldn't help but glance out the window, watching the ground grow smaller as the plane prepared for takeoff. As the aircraft lifted off the tarmac, David closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the sensation of flight to wash over him. He thought about the journey ahead, not just the physical flight, but the emotional one as well. He had faced challenges and disrespect, but he was also surrounded by people who cared and recognized his sacrifices. In that moment, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The world might have its share of Ryans, but it also had its Kravitzes, individuals who saw beyond the surface and chose to make a difference. David vowed to carry this lesson with him, reminding himself that kindness and recognition could change someone's day or even their life. And for every moment of disrespect he encountered, there would be countless others willing to lift him up. As the plane climbed higher into the sky, David settled into the rhythm of the flight. The soft hum of the engines became a soothing backdrop, allowing him to reflect on the morning's events. He gazed out the window, watching the clouds drift beneath him, soft and billowy like cotton candy. For a moment, he let himself drift into a peaceful state, grateful for the kindness he had experienced from Captain Kravitz and the flight attendants.
Yet as the altitude increased, so did his thoughts about the encounter at the TSA checkpoint. Ryan's mocking laughter and dismissive attitude still echoed in his mind, a stark reminder of the challenges veterans often faced. Despite the warmth of the cabin, David felt a flicker of frustration. How could someone so young and privileged be so devoid of respect? The flight attendants moved gracefully down the aisle, taking drink orders and checking on passengers. One of them, a young woman with bright eyes and a friendly smile, stopped by David's seat. "Can I offer you something to drink, Mr. Thompson?" she asked, her voice cheerful. "Lemon water, please," he replied, appreciating her genuine demeanor. As she poured the drink, David couldn't help but notice the subtle differences in how people treated him now compared to moments earlier at the airport. Here, in this space, he felt valued and respected. The flight attendant returned with his drink, placing it gently on the tray table. "Thank you for your service," she said softly, her eyes meeting his with sincerity.
"Thank you for noticing," David responded, feeling a warmth spread through him. It was a small gesture, but it carried weight, an acknowledgement of his sacrifices and the struggles he faced. As the flight continued, David found himself engaged in quiet conversations with the passengers around him. A middle-aged man in a charcoal grey suit leaned over, curiosity evident in his expression. "You're a veteran, aren't you?" he asked, nodding toward David's leg. "I thought so. My brother served in the Air Force and got out in 04. "Respect to him," David replied, appreciating the connection. The man hesitated before continuing. "I saw what happened at security. That was completely out of line." David exhaled through his nose, grateful for the man's empathy. "People don't always know what they're looking at," he said, reflecting on the weight of misunderstandings. The man nodded, his expression serious. "They forget there's a difference between protecting and profiling," he said. David felt a sense of camaraderie with this stranger, a shared understanding that transcended their differences. As the flight progressed, David became lost in his thoughts, reflecting on the ongoing journey of his life. He remembered his time in Afghanistan, the harsh realities of combat, and the sacrifices he had made. Yet he also recalled the moments of kindness that had come unexpectedly, like the captain's gesture and this stranger's understanding. These experiences reminded him that while there would always be those who failed to respect him, there were countless others who would stand by his side. Just then, a voice from the front of the cabin interrupted his reverie. Captain Kravitz emerged from the cockpit, walking down the aisle with purpose. As he approached, David noticed how the atmosphere shifted. Passengers straightened in their seats, and an air of respect filled the space. Kravitz had a way of commanding attention without demanding it. "Hope everyone is enjoying the flight," he said with a genuine smile. Then his gaze landed on David. "I just wanted to check in on you. How's everything going?" David felt a swell of gratitude at the captain's thoughtfulness.
"It's going well, thank you. I appreciate everything you did earlier." Kravitz nodded, his expression affirming. "Just remember, you're not alone in this. You have support." The flight attendants continued their rounds, ensuring everyone was comfortable. David took a moment to absorb the respect and kindness surrounding him. It was a stark contrast to the derision he had faced earlier, and it filled him with hope. As the plane leveled off, David leaned back in his seat, allowing himself to relax fully.
The clouds below looked like a vast expanse of white, stretching endlessly into the horizon. He closed his eyes briefly, breathing in the moment of peace, and realized that despite the challenges he faced, he was surrounded by people who understood. This journey was more than just a flight. It was a reminder of the strength found in kindness and the power of connection. No matter the obstacles he had encountered, he would carry this lesson with him, an affirmation that dignity and respect could flourish in the most unexpected places. As the flight approached its descent into Atlanta, David felt a mix of anticipation and reflection. The morning had been filled with challenges, but it had also highlighted the importance of kindness and recognition. His thoughts drifted back to the moments of support from Captain Kravitz, the flight attendants, and even the fellow passengers who had shown him respect. It was a stark contrast to the negativity he had faced earlier, and it filled him with a renewed sense of purpose. Once the plane touched down smoothly on the tarmac, David felt the familiar rush of excitement that came with returning home. As the aircraft taxied toward the terminal, he sat quietly, absorbing the atmosphere around him. Passengers began gathering their belongings, the low rustle of movement filling the cabin. David took a deep breath, reminding himself of the journey he had undertaken, not just the physical flight, but the emotional one as well. As the seatbelt sign flicked off, David stood up slowly, the slight ache in his prosthetic leg reminding him of the sacrifices he had made. He moved through the aisle deliberately, feeling the eyes of other passengers on him. Some were curious, glancing his way with a mix of admiration and concern, while others were preoccupied with their own lives. He stepped off the plane, ready to face whatever waited for him in the terminal. As he walked toward the baggage claim, he spotted Ryan standing near the gate, clipboard in hand. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and David felt a flicker of triumph. There was no need for words. The silence spoke volumes. Ryan's posture seemed a bit stiffer, and he quickly averted his gaze, perhaps realizing the weight of his earlier actions. David walked past him without a hint of hesitation, his chin held high. Once inside the terminal, the familiar hustle and bustle of travelers enveloped him. David paused for a moment, taking in the sights and sounds. It was a world that moved quickly, a stark contrast to the quiet he had often experienced after returning from deployment. He spotted a family with small children, the kids laughing and running toward their parents. A wave of warmth washed over him as he observed their joy. It reminded him of the simple things in life that brought happiness. Just then a young boy no older than 10 approached him, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Excuse me, sir," the boy said shyly. "Are you a soldier?" David knelt down slightly to meet the boy's gaze. "I was," he replied with a gentle smile. The boy's eyes lit up. "Did you really lose a leg?" he asked, his innocence shining through. David nodded, feeling a mix of pride and nostalgia. "I did, but I have a special leg now that helps me walk. It reminds me of where I've been." The boy seemed to ponder this for a moment, then asked, "Did it hurt?" David smiled softly, appreciating the boy's genuine curiosity. "Some things do hurt, but hurting isn't the same as stopping," he replied, hoping to impart a small lesson. The boy's mother, who had been watching from a distance, approached with a look of gratitude. "Thank you for talking to him. He's always had so many questions about soldiers," she said, her voice filled with appreciation. David stood up, feeling a sense of fulfillment. "It's my pleasure. Kids have a way of seeing things clearly," he said, glancing back at the boy, who was still looking at him with admiration. As he continued toward the exit, David felt a shift within himself. He realized that his journey didn't end with this flight. It was just a new beginning. The moments of kindness he had experienced reminded him of the importance of sharing his story and connecting with others. He thought about how many people might benefit from hearing about his experiences, not just the struggles, but also the strength he had gained from them. Outside the terminal, David spotted his friend Reggie, who was waiting for him with a broad smile.
"Look at you, first class and all," Reggie teased, leaning across the car's seat for a fist bump. "Did you get champagne up there or just fancy peanuts?" "Just water and legroom, but I'll take it," David replied, laughing with relief. As they drove away from the airport, Reggie turned to him. "Heard about the security mess? Word travels fast." David chuckled quietly, shaking his head. "You know how it is," he said. "I'm just tired of explaining what shouldn't need explaining." Reggie nodded knowingly. "Ain't it something? We give pieces of ourselves for this country and still have to prove we deserve basic respect." David glanced out the window, watching the familiar streets of his hometown pass by. Yeah, but at least some people have your back, he said, reflecting on the support he had received during the flight. As they pulled into David's driveway, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. The small brick house with its trimmed lawn looked inviting, a sanctuary after the chaos of the day. He stepped out of the car, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, feeling a weight lift from him.
Before heading inside, he paused to take a deep breath of the fresh air. This was home, a place where he could reflect and recharge. He headed to his small office where he had a desk and a notepad waiting for him. As he sat down, he felt the urge to write, to share his story, the lessons learned, the battles fought, and the triumphs celebrated. He picked up a pen and wrote at the top of the page, "You don't have to march to stand tall." With that, he smiled, knowing that his story was just beginning. It was time to remind the world that dignity doesn't ask for permission. It simply exists, and sometimes the biggest impact comes not from grand gestures, but from the quiet strength of simply being.